Hi, my name's Mike Wooldridge, and it's my very, very great pleasure to be able to speak to you today. And of course, I am absolutely delighted to be able to accept and acknowledge the Outstanding Educator Award from AAAI and the Educational Advances in AI conference. I'm extremely grateful. It's an unexpected honor, but I will do my best to live up to it. So when I was asked to give a talk for the conference, I was presented with a dilemma. Obviously, the talks that I'm most used to giving are about my research, which is in multi-agent systems. And I guess one option for the talk would have been to talk about, for example, my book on multi-agent systems, my textbook on multi-agent systems, which I think is probably one of the reasons that I was the recipient of the Outstanding Educator Award this year. But frankly, that seemed like a bit boring to me. I don't think you greatly want to hear about contemporary curriculums for AI. So after a bit of deliberation, what I decided to do is to try to distill some of my experiences over the past few years in talking to the public about artificial intelligence. Now, I'm well aware that there are many members of AAAI who do this on a regular basis, and some of them I'm quite sure are much better than I am, so apologies to them. But these are my experiences. This is what I found over the last few years when I've gone out and tried to talk to a non-specialist audience. When I say public, I just mean a non-specialist audience, not AAAI members, about what artificial intelligence is and what it can do and the things that we should be concerned about versus the things we should not be concerned about, and so on. So that's what this talk is. And I've tried to distill it down to around about 15 individual lessons, which are the kind of take-home messages. So if you are contemplating talking to the public about AI, I very much hope that you will find these lessons useful. So first, how did I get into all of this? Well, this is just literally a true story. I was sat at my desk in late 2014. I sat at my desk in the University of Oxford, and the telephone rang. And actually, that in itself, of course, is a slightly unusual thing these days. But it was a researcher for the BBC, a researcher for the BBC news desk. And they said, was I available for an interview? This was a first for me. They said, was I available for an interview as an expert on artificial intelligence? That's what they said. I said, this was a first for me. So I said, what about? And they said, well, Stephen Hawking, of course, we all know who Stephen Hawking is, then the world's most famous scientist, the late, great Stephen Hawking, says AI might be the end of mankind. So they told me a little bit about what he'd said, and I quickly went away and Googled it. And I bottled it, as they say in England. I didn't do the interview. I didn't quite have the courage to do the interview. And so here is the punchline. I declined because I just assumed that actually there must be somebody out there who was going to respond to this, who was going to be smarter and more eloquent and more informed than I was. And I thought that they would be able to get that person. Only they didn't. And this was the start of this kind of journey for me. And that was a sort of an eye-opening occasion for me when I realized that the experts that organizations like the BBC look to are not some kind of special breed. They're just researchers like you and me. They are not necessarily people that have had specialist training in talking to the media, but they're people who, when they are put up there, actually have to stand up and be counted and stand up and answer these questions. So I say this was the story. This was the beginning of the journey for me. I declined because I thought they'd find somebody better, and they didn't. Okay, so lesson number one, I said I was going to distill 15 lessons from this. If you don't inform the public about AI, then someone who knows even less than you will. Okay, now I'm obviously exaggerating a little bit. In this particular case, I don't remember who they got to interview, if they got anybody, but this is the kind of thing that I've seen happen time and time again. We like to believe somehow, when I was a PhD student, I sort of somehow imagined that there was some great scientific committee in the sky who would, who would delegate their members to be able to respond to these kind of occasions. And it just isn't true. There is just you and me and other researchers like us. And if we don't respond, somebody else will. And the person who does respond might know a great deal less about the subject than you do. So you may regret it for that reason. So that's lesson number one. Okay. So my journey began there. My public science journey began in 2014 or thereabouts, when the press and social media began to fill up with the breathless stories about AI. And of course, the truth is the breathless stories about AI were really breathless stories about machine learning. But of course, the press doesn't distinguish between AI and machine learning. Perhaps that should have been a lesson, but actually that's the truth of it. And so who will respond to these narratives, I wondered, and nobody did. There was a vacuum, and there was a very palpable vacuum. I don't remember if it was before or after Stephen Hawking, but Elon Musk made similar statements. And in the UK, Martin Rees, a very, very distinguished physicist, former head of the Royal Society, which is the top scientific organization in the UK, also made similar statements that he was concerned that AI was taking us to a very, very dark place. And it wasn't necessarily that I agreed with, or disagreed rather, with all of these statements, but there was some nuance there that I thought was missing. And there was a big part of the AI story that I thought was missing. And there was a vacuum. As I say, there was no great AI committee in the sky that delegated their worthies to be able to answer these kind of queries. So the first thing I did was I was chairing in 2015 IGCEPeyKy, the International Joint Conference on AI. I'm sure a conference that most AAAI members will be very, very aware of. And I organized a panel. Of course, we have to organize a number of panels. And in the space of that vacuum, I thought it would be interesting to organize a panel entitled Who Speaks for AI? So literally, this was the question of, who is going to be that voice which is going to be responding when people like Elon and Stephen Hawking and Martin Rees and many, many others make these public proclamations which make the front pages of newspapers internationally and get thousands and thousands of views on YouTube and so on. So I organized this panel, and on the left, the panel was written up in the event for an article, and this is a superset of the speakers. But if I recall, we certainly had Maria Gini and Barbara Gross and Rao Kampambati, Francesca Rossi was there, Stuart Russell was there, I think Toby was there, Toby Walsh was there, and myself, I was the chair. We also had Manuela Veloso. Manuela was a member of the panel, possibly some others. So this is the write-up. You can, if you Google it, appeared in AI Matters Volume 2, Issue 2, so you can find the write-up there. So here is my mental narrative of what I thought was going to happen. Where I thought my sort of view of this was, where I was going to steer it was that organizations like AAAI and IGCEPeyKy and others should act as a responsible public voice for AI. That is, when Elon or Stephen Hawking or whoever it was made their public proclamations, I thought that maybe these organizations, the European AI Association as well, should be the responsible public voice for AI. And what I had in mind, this was at exactly the time that there was the large international movement against lethal autonomous weapons, where we were all asked to be signatories to a statement opposing the development and deployment of lethal autonomous weapons, and very many of us did. And my sort of mental model for this was the kind of the Committee of Atomic Scientists, which is, after World War II, many scientists who'd been involved in the Manhattan Project got together to form the Committee of Atomic Scientists, who released public proclamations from time to time about the development of nuclear weapons and the proliferation of nuclear weapons. So that was my theme. And if anything, I genuinely was quite worried that this was going to be a very boring panel. There were panels, I think, on deep learning and convolutional neural networks and all the stuff that people get excited about. And I thought that's where the excitement was going to be. I did not expect any excitement whatsoever on this panel. Well, with my hand on my heart, I think we didn't video it. I really wish we had done, because I wish you could watch it if you weren't there. Firstly, it was a very busy panel. The room was full. And it was the most incredibly heated panel I've ever served on. It got shouty. People were shouting at each other. There were members of the audience shouting. There were members of the panel shouting. It was really quite astonishing. And it was actually one of those occasions where I was like thinking, oh my God, I'm losing control of this panel completely. Where are we going with this? And what it became clear was the following. What became clear was the following. There were quite large proportions of the population who felt that organizations like AAAI and IGCI and YourAI had no role whatsoever to be doing anything other than speaking for the science. Their role in organizing a conference was to assess the quality of the science and nothing else. Anything else that these organizations did was stepping into political territory. And with respect to the specific question of lethal autonomous weapons, I obviously inhabit a liberal bubble, possibly the liberal bubble of all liberal bubbles. And most of the people that I speak to on a daily basis take it for granted that we should not develop lethal autonomous weapons. And that's my own personal view. That panel really opened my eyes. There are many members of our community who do not take that for granted whatsoever. They think our community, our scientific communities, have no role whatsoever to be speaking about issues like lethal autonomous weapons. And that was, as you can imagine, that was the point at which the panel got most heated and most vocal. But it was really an eye-opening experience for me. And I won't name members of the community, but there were very, very strong voices there who said that kind of proclamation, if AAAI or IGCI or whoever made a proclamation like that, we should not develop and deploy lethal autonomous weapons, I would resign instantly and never submit to this conference again. That was the kind of the tone of some of the voices in the audience. So anything going beyond the science, they believed, was a matter of politics. And they said, typically it's liberal politics. You're just making lazy liberal assumptions that do not reflect the views necessarily of the entire community and your personal preferences and upbringings. And I say, my personal perspective, I think, is probably a fairly liberal one. So on the flight home, I mean, this was really a shouty panel. And on the flight home, I was mulling over what had happened on that panel, which I thought was a great panel. It did possibly more than any other panel I've ever served on, and I've served on quite a few, to really open eyes, and I think it opened a lot of eyes in the audience as well, to the different viewpoints and different perspectives. But reflecting on this on the way home, I felt, as a member of the AI community, as a scientist, a responsible scientist, I felt I had an obligation to take a kind of responsible standpoint, to try to, where I was asked to inform public opinion, not necessarily about ethics and morality. I agree, many of those questions are beyond my capabilities as a scientist, but certainly about the capabilities and the likely direction of the science. And to say where I perceive risks, to draw attention without saying whether things are right or wrong, but to draw attention to what those risks are. If you develop this technology, then these are the things that it might be used for. These are the things that might happen. I felt if I'm taking public money, and I do from time to time anyway, take public money for my research, then that's the very least that I can do to respond. Now, even that position, I think, is probably a strong position for some of the people that were in the audience, an overly strong position for some of the people that were in the audience that day. So lesson number 2 of my 15 lessons is that issues of AI, ethics and morality that seem self-evident and axiomatic to you seem just so blindingly obvious to you that they're not even discussion points. They're just absolutely take this for granted points, are not taken for granted by other members of the community and will be regarded as controversial. And the truth is, you do not have the right to impose your views on others. All you can do is inform public debate. That's my personal perspective. I can inform public debate, and I have an obligation to inform public debate. But I don't have the right to impose my wishy-washy liberal views on anybody. So that's lesson number 2. And it really is an important lesson. Stuff that you take for granted is not taken for granted by other members of the community. Things that you think are obvious are not obvious to other members of the community. So all you can do in the space of that is to inform the public debate in as balanced and a transparent and as honest a way as you possibly can. Okay, so that was the beginning of my journey. That was the beginning of my my journey about informing the public debate. And so where has it led me? And I say, I'm looking at this list. I'm well aware that there are many triple AI fellows and others who've done much, much more than this. So I'm slightly embarrassed about presenting this to you. But by regular academic standards, I think this is probably quite a lot compared to what a number of people have done. So anyway, what does it amount to? UK government committees. I've given evidence to UK government committees, and I've given 5 formal evidence sessions to date, and I'll talk about those shortly. I've written 2 popular science books on AI, so you see the covers of 2 of them. On the left here, the Ladybird Expert Guide to AI, and the right, The Road to Conscious Machines, and in the middle, the US edition of The Road to Conscious Machines, which has just appeared in the US under the title of A Brief History of Artificial Intelligence. I've given a lot of talks at literary festivals and popular science festivals, and I'll talk about my experience there. I've given a number of TV and radio interviews to the BBC and others. I've spoken at endless industrial conferences, which exploded around the time that AI was taking off. I've done journalism, for example, writing articles for the Financial Times and for other serious newspapers and others. A couple of those are appearing around about now. The Chronicle of Higher Education is publishing something around about now that was written by me, and a couple of other venues. I've done a number of different podcasts. I've lost track of how many different podcasts I've done, mostly around the theme of what is AI, where is AI going, what is the reality of AI versus the hype, and so on. So the rest of this talk, what I'm going to do is, I say, we're starting from that standpoint of me reflecting on that panel and how heated it became, and what should I do in response to that, and my belief that as a responsible scientist who takes public money, I have an obligation to inform the public debate in as balanced and a transparent way as I possibly can, without imposing my own personal ethical standpoint on other people. And this is where I've been. Okay. So let's talk about the first one, advising government. So this is something which I think would have been really unimaginable 20 years ago, advising government on AI. I don't think the government in the UK or the US or elsewhere would have been greatly interested in artificial intelligence. They were interested in things like nanotechnology and other exciting developments that were all current around about the year 2000. So, but, you know, the rise of AI, which we began to see sort of around about 2015, and it beginning to make the press, governments across the globe were prompted to investigate AI, to look at what it was and to consider national responses. And I have to say, in the UK, that's been good news for the AI community. I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. Mostly good news for the AI community. I think the responses that we've seen in the UK, which mostly take the form of specific investments around trying to, for example, build up the number of PhD graduates in AI. As an AI researcher, I can't spin those in any negative way. So I'm very pleased with the UK's AI response. But I've seen international responses in Singapore, in France, in Germany, in Sweden, in the US and elsewhere, in Canada and so on, that have been similarly promising. So the specific contributions that I've done are contributing, given evidence at an all-party parliamentary group on AI. This is an all-party, suggests that it's not tied to any specific political dimension. It includes members from across the political spectrum. These are relatively informal things in the UK, but much more formal are House of Lords committees. And I've given evidence at the House of Lords Select Committee on AI and the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technologies. And these are quite biggies because they have some heft. What they say has some influence. The government is obliged, the standing government of the day is obliged to make a formal response to these, saying how they will respond to recommendations that are made by these committees. So what do they look like? Well, on the right, this is what one looks like. This is in fact not the one that I was on, but it shows the typical format of these. These individuals up here are the lords. They literally are lords. So there were lords, there were earls, there was a viscount, there was a lord bishop on the AI select committee. And here is me. This is the evidence was videoed. You can watch it. If you've really got nothing better to do with your time during lockdown, you can watch the video of me giving evidence. What this doesn't show, in fact, is that as I was making notes moments before we went live, the pen that I was making notes with broke and completely covered my hand in black ink. So I spend the entire time trying to hide, somewhat unsuccessfully, my hand, which is soaked in black ink, under the table. It was not the most promising way to start. But what I want to draw your attention to is the kind of, these are the witnesses, the three people sitting in front of this committee, is they have a very, very legalistic tone. You are giving evidence. You are called to give evidence, and they give you a dossier of things that you're supposed to do and not supposed to do while you're on there. You have to wait outside the room until you're called to come in, and then you take this seat in front of these very, very imposing individuals. And the way it works is that the select committee calls for written evidence before it takes place, well in advance. So I submitted written evidence, and it's all public. You can read my written evidence. Looking back on it, I don't think I said anything too crazy in my written evidence. And then I received an invitation to the first House of Lords Select Committee evidence hearing, the first public hearing, October 2007. They take place in the House of Lords in Westminster, which is not, in case you are wondering, a place that I frequent normally. And actually, this is part of the picture, because it's quite intimidating. The Palace of Westminster is an intimidating place. Of course, it was designed to be intimidating, right? I mean, it's designed to be imposing and intimidating. You are supposed to feel the weight of authority when you go into this. And then you go in and give your evidence, and it feels like you're on trial. So this is, I took this picture of the door just before we went into our hearing. And on my hearing, there was also Wendy Hall, who's Regis Professor of Computer Science at the University of Southampton, and Nick Bostrom, as I'm sure many of you will know, who's the author, who's also at the University of Oxford in the philosophy department, who's the author of the Superintelligence bestseller book, which appeared in, I think, 2014. So this is what I wanted to say. These are the messages. I mean, people told me, look, you need to try and identify what your messages are. This is what I wanted to say. I said, well, AI probably isn't what you think it is. Forget about Hollywood. There is real progress in AI this century. This progress is in machine learning. It's driven by some scientific advances. And the way that I always say that, it's the deep part of deep learning. That's the new thing in machine learning. But also just as important is big data and cheap compute power, which enables us to build the AI systems that we now have that can do these impressive things like caption images and recognize faces in pictures and do automated translation, passable automated translation. And what I wanted to say is these advances are exciting. These are things that represent real progress in AI, but they are narrow, and they don't show us any way to the grand dream of AI. And I also wanted to say, and I realize this is probably controversial with some listeners, that I was concerned that long-term speculative concerns about what AI might be capable of in some point in the future shouldn't distract us from the near-term worries. So what I wanted to say was, look, if this committee is going to come out with recommendations, fine, let it come out with recommendations about long-term speculative concerns. But I think it's really important that you should recognize what the challenges are right now, the way that AI is likely to be affecting people this year and next year and in the immediate future. And what are those concerns? Well, bias being the headline example. At the time, there were lots of examples emerging of bias in AI systems. So, I mean, the grotesque example of the automated captioning system labels pictures of gorillas as black people, for example. That was, I think, was current at the time or round about then. And lots of other horrible examples of AI bias. And of course, the list has just got longer since then. The issues of brittleness, the way that this technology can break in unexpected ways. You know, we think that a machine learning program is going to, we train it on some examples. It seems to give us the right examples, but then it falls apart in really unexpected ways on adversarial examples and so on. Issues of employment, even though personally, I think in the long term, I'm not overly concerned about issues of AI employment, but there are issues around that we need. And the messages for the UK, where should the UK go? Well, I said we need capacity. We are a small nation. We need to build up the number of people with experience in AI because there's huge demand for those people from industry and from government and so on. So when I talk about capacity, that's what I mean. And I also wanted to say, and I'm well aware that this is that people will interpret this as a political judgment, and a number of my colleagues disagree with me on this. I said, well, the UK historically is well placed for AI, but Brexit is damaging, and it's damaging to the goal of attracting AI talent to the UK. I say, actually, I didn't mean that to be a political message. I just said, look, whether or not Brexit is right or wrong, the truth is it's not great from the perspective of trying to attract talent to the UK. And above all, don't be distracted by the media hype, I wanted to say. AI is genuine and exciting, but it isn't magic. These advances are real and they're exciting, but there's no magic there. And there's no sort of magic wand that we've now got that we can wave over systems, which gives them, the Hollywood dream of AI. So that's what I wanted to say. And I thought that was a reasonable message. And how I wanted to appear, and I literally thought about this, the kind of tone that I wanted was the kind of Walter Cronkite tone, the most trusted anchorman ever. If Walter Cronkite said something, you believed him, right? This sort of authority voice, this voice of authority, this trusted authority voice. And that's how I wanted to appear. This balance, these are the advances. This is the truth. Don't get excited and distracted. Well, that's how I wanted to appear, but for reasons that will become clear, I think what the media saw was something slightly different. By the way, I think this is a much better version of The Nutty Professor than the later ones. This is one that I watched when I was a 10-year-old that made me ache with laughter. But anyway, this is what the media saw. They saw this kind of nutty professor. So, and in particular, one of the subsequent speakers who gave evidence to the House of Lords was from the Register, which is an online media source that many of you will be familiar with. And I was certainly familiar with it before I went live with my talk. And the speaker with the evidence giver was Andrew Orlovsky. Because it's useful to see ourselves occasionally as others see you. This is what he wrote in that article. You can, if you Google the Register Wooldridge AI House of Lords, you'll find the article easily enough if you want to have a laugh. So he said, Wooldridge and Person X bubbled with enthusiasm like teenagers on nitrous oxide. AI is amazing. When academics ask for more resources, it's coded. We need more capacity, said Wooldridge. Well, indeed, I did say we needed more capacity. I have some sympathy for an AI veteran like Wooldridge. The AI winters have been around for so very long and cold. The summers are so short. You can't blame him for running around like a squirrel on an autumn day, collecting as many nuts as he can. I've learned he's writing 2 children's books on machine learning. That's 2 nuts at least. However, if Wooldridge harbored any doubts about the epoch-changing potential of machine learning, doubts which have come to the surface this year, he kept them to himself, etc., etc., etc. It goes on in that vein like quite a long time. So it's rather sobering when, as it literally happened, I was on the train on the way home and I read this story. So I say that's how you think you appear or how you want to appear. But as far as the Register was concerned, that's how I appeared. Well, the Register has to sell newspapers, or rather get clicks, right? So they weren't going to get a click by saying AI professor says something sensible about AI, but nevertheless, it was a bit of a wake-up call for me. So despite that, the feedback I had from the Lords was positive, and I had the pleasure of meeting a number of the committee members who were on the other side of the table, who were asking us the questions subsequently, and they were extremely supportive and very clear that they felt that the evidence that I gave was clear and useful, and that they did actually hear the message. I think, unlike what the Register claimed, they heard the message about distinguish the hype from the reality, and the reality is exciting, but it's not the Hollywood reality. I guess the most important thing is that, we did in fact see a big increase in capacity in the UK. So I think I'm pleased that I had a tiny part to play in that. That was a very important part of the message that I wanted to communicate. There's been a big investment in PhD students in AI in the UK, but above all, as evidence that they thought I was doing something useful, they invited me back to give evidence. And I subsequently been back to the House of Lords Select Committee and the House of Lords Select Committee on Science and Technology. So lessons. Firstly, this is the register lesson. If you put your head above the parapet, then people will take aim and fire at it. And if you aren't ready for that, don't do that. Right? I mean, don't do it. It's not fun to read stuff like what the register wrote about you, even if you believe that they just wrote it to try and get some clicks. It isn't fun. And if you're going to take offense at that and take it too seriously, then possibly doing this kind of stuff isn't really the sort of thing that you should be doing. But actually, the truth is, it isn't the end of the world, as we used to say in the UK. Today's newspapers are tomorrow's chip papers. You know, today's clickbait is tomorrow's history. So it isn't the end of the world when people say that, but be aware it can happen. If you put your head above the parapet, people will take aim and shoot. The other thing is, and this is a really difficult one, is you are forced down because these evidence sessions are so compressed, you can't give them an essay. You need to distill your message, distill it again and again and again, and prioritize the messages that you want to get across. I think I more or less got across all the messages that I wanted to, but if you're verbose, they won't hear it, right? They won't hear it and they'll cut you off, and you won't get time to communicate it. So you have to keep your message. Think about the headline message that you want to get across, the take-home message, and you need to say it explicitly and simply and clearly. And the truth is, however much you distill and simplify that lesson, they will then distill it even further, right? So no matter how clear and transparent and simple you are, they will simplify the message even further. So there is very limited scope for nuance. Nuance will just be missed. There are all sorts of other things that that you need to say about this, like, you know, avoiding technicalities, and getting bogged down in technicalities. And we are used as academics to wrapping up the things that we say in all sorts of caveats. If you use too many caveats, that your message just won't be heard. You have to distill it and distill it and distill it and be very clear about exactly what you want to say. So it isn't a bad idea at all to actually have a storyboard for the messages like this when you go into an evidence session like that, literally to have a bullet point list no longer than that, exactly of that form with the things that you want to say. Lesson 5 was quite interesting. So they are intimidating. I found it intimidating. I've never given evidence in the House of Lords. I went to a very ordinary state school in the United Kingdom. Nobody I know when I grew up was in a position like that. I don't get to hang around with senior government officials very often. But here's the thing, I was intimidated by them, but by the same token, they were intimidated by me, I realized. I was the expert. I was the professor. I was the one with all the academic qualifications. I was the expert on the day. They may be senior government officials, maybe even household names, and a couple of the people pretty much filled that category. But they see you as the person with all the qualifications, more qualifications than they could possibly dream of. So that should give you confidence. You are the expert and they're intimidated by you. They see a professor from MIT or Oxford or Cambridge or Stanford or Berkeley or whatever it is, and they're intimidated by you just as much or even more than you are intimidated by them. So that should give you some courage and strength when you go into these things. One other important thing, and I think this is the register lesson. I was wondering about where they picked up on all those things that they said about why did they think I was such a wild-eyed loon. And here's the thing: when you say breakthrough in AI, right? You sort of thing that you might say to your colleagues, oh, there's been a real breakthrough in computational social choice, so-and-so's paper. I think that's a real breakthrough paper. Right? And you may mean by that paper has a really cute theorem. There's some really nice stuff in that paper, but that's not what they hear on the other side of the table. What they hear is robot butlers tomorrow. They hear Hollywood dream of AI is just around the corner. So you have to be really, really careful in the language that you use. So you need to be not try and avoid words like breakthrough. or fundamental advance, because if you say that, people will interpret it in a completely different way. Okay, so that's giving evidence at the House of Lords. So the next thing I did was, and I did this again, literally did this, started a Microsoft Word file on the flight home from IDGCi 2015 with the title page of a book. And the first title that entered my head was The Road to Conscious Machines, the story of AI. I thought, I've written books before, textbooks, I think that's one of the reasons that I got the Outstanding Educator Award. So I thought, well, why not write a popular science book on AI? Well, ultimately where it led me is to two books, The Road to Conscious Machines and the other book, this Ladybird expert book that I'll talk about here. And the US edition, A Brief History of Artificial Intelligence, as I say, was on sale in the US from January 19th, published by Flatiron Press. So I decided to write a popular science book on AI, and this should probably be a lesson. I did that at a really bad time. Might have been a great idea to do in 2012, wasn't necessarily such a good idea to do in 2015. Why? Because there were a number of other very good books. So Stuart Russell's Human Compatible, Toby Walsh's Android Dreams, which appeared under another number of other titles, and Toby subsequently published another book, and another great book by Ernie Davis and Gary Marcus, Rebooting Artificial Intelligence, which appeared last year. So it wasn't great timing because there were a number of other people publishing books on AI, but nevertheless, it seemed like a good idea. And I'd written books before, so I wasn't totally intimidated by that. And I've been around long enough in AI that I thought I could tell an interesting story about AI. But it actually turned into two books, one published in 2018, The Ladybird Expert Guide to AI, and The Road to Conscious Machines, which appeared in 2020 with the US edition appearing in 2021. And I was lucky to get an agent in January 2017. And I'll come back and talk about agents a little bit later on. So the first of these books, The Ladybird Expert Guide to AI. So people from the UK and from the UK Commonwealth, so countries like Canada and India and Singapore, probably will be familiar with the Ladybird series. I think in North America, in the US, sorry, not so much. It was a very famous UK series, extremely prominent from around about 1940 to around about 1980, became a bit unfashionable in 1980. And they're very short books. They're quite small, physically quite small books. I mean, one of the big selling points was you could just fit them into your coat pocket. They were quite cheap. They were the kind of things when I was growing up that your uncles and aunts would buy you as a birthday present because they couldn't think of anything else to buy you. And one of the USPs about these books is that they were very short. I mean, in total, just 54 pages, but each page would have a special illustration, a specially commissioned illustration. And there were hundreds and hundreds of these Ladybird books. You can go on eBay and have a look at them. A lot of them are collector's items now. And there were books on history. So the Crusades was a very famous one, and all about English kings and queens and the American Civil War, and the Spanish Armada. And there were books about the profession. So you could buy books about being a policeman and things like that, and being a nurse, and so on. And they were mostly aimed at children, and some of the books were to help children to read. Most of them were aimed at kind of early teenagers, and the basic idea was they gave you non-threatening introductions to subjects like the Crusades or the American Civil War and so on. And this was the interesting thing for me. They were so iconic when I grew up. When I was asked to do one on AI, and actually I was asked to do one as a side project for the much longer book, The Road to Conscious Machines, I didn't even think about it. They were so iconic and such a big part of my childhood that I just said, yeah, of course I'll do one. And I emphasize these are entirely serious books on AI, despite the entirely serious books, despite the slightly comical illustrations. But it was the non-threatening aspect of it. A cheap book, that was non-threatening. So you could buy a 600-page tome by an AI worthy, which would explain in detail what convolutional neural nets do. Or you could buy a non-threatening short book with cute illustrations, which would cost you around about the price of a pint of beer and would fit in your pocket and that you could read in 2 hours. And that's what sold me on this idea of doing the Ladybird Expert Guide. So I say for viewers that are from the UK and possibly from Canada, but from Singapore and Australia and so on, they will be familiar, I think, with this series. It was great fun. I loved doing this. And the challenge was to distill the whole of AI into 54 pages. And I wanted to do justice to the full range of AI. I wanted no hype. I wanted it to be balanced. I wanted the same kind of messages that I put across in the House of Lords. And I also wanted to communicate something about my sense of wonder, which I think is really important. I love AI because it's the most endlessly fascinating subject I know of. And I wanted to communicate some of that personal fascination in the book. So in the end, it was mostly a historical narrative at the end, which becomes a little bit speculative and talks a little bit about things that you should be afraid of and not afraid of. Some of the readers didn't like the historical things. Some said I should have just ignored most of the 70-year history of AI and focused on the last 10 years because they said everything else is an irrelevance. I disagreed. I think AI is bigger and more important than that. But that was the book that I came out with. One thing that was exciting for me was the illustrator. I expected to be an impoverished art student, but the illustrator they hired was somebody called Stephen Player. And he is the professional illustrator. And what grabbed my attention is that he illustrates Terry Pratchett's books. And if you're a fan of fantasy, and in particular comedy fantasy, you'll surely know who Terry Pratchett is. There's a side story, and you'll have to get me a beer to explain this in detail. I love the illustrations, but actually I had to complain about the first drafts because Stephen's first drafts included some very sexually suggestive illustrations involving robots. And the blood drained from my face when I saw these drafts, and I had to go back and say, sorry, we have to go back to the drawing board. No way can we publish those. So in fact, you know, what you see in this book is a very revised version of the illustration. Other stuff I learned after my first draft, which I was very proud of, the publisher said, well, this is great, but can we throw in, for example, something about Asimov's laws and the singularity and things like that, which were all in sort of places that I didn't really want to go. But at their advice or insistence, I went there. I'm immensely proud of the end result. I've got lots of positive feedback. I've got feedback, emails from kids and adults who've read the book. To my astonishment, it's used as a set text on an executive training course about AI. Which actually gives me the most sales that I have for this book. There's a Chinese translation from it. And the thing that I'm most excited about is that the book got picked up by Penguin, who have a special series for people that are learning English as a foreign language. And this series goes out internationally across the world. And of course, there's very many people internationally who want to learn English as a foreign language. And they pick certain of their books which they focus on, and they do some rewriting to get the language to a certain level. And they chose my book, and it's appearing in that series quite soon. And I'm just delighted by the fact that kids internationally are learning how to read English, how to learn the English language by reading my book. That's just so rewarding. So this was great fun to do, despite the potential disaster with the illustrations as they first appeared. The second book was much longer. It was much more ambitious. It was called The Road to Conscious Machines. That was the working title, and it just stuck. The publisher liked it. A number of other people didn't. Actually, it's not really about conscious machines. I touch on, can machines ever be conscious at the end? Really, it's a kind of a story of AI, what AI is, all the different ideas that have informed AI, symbolic AI, behavioral AI, up to the current day, and neural AI, talking about what AI can and can't do, or what I think AI will be going to, and so on. And I completed my first draft a year later than I hoped. I completed my first draft of 100,000 words in January 2019, emailed it off, one large Word file to the publisher, and oh my God, did they come back with some corrections. So I had to cut 30,000 words from the first draft and then write another 30,000 words. That's actually quite a lot of words. I mean, 100,000 words is far longer than my PhD thesis. And the editors at Penguin, which is the Pelican is an imprint of Penguin, they gave me far more revisions than I had for my PhD. It was a lot more work than writing a PhD. They gave me a long list of demands that I had to do to rewrite this. So it took me another 7 or 8 months to rewrite it. But they were right, by and large. I think the feedback that they gave me was exactly right. And it was a lot better as a book in the end. So what did I learn for this? It was a lot of fun. It was a tremendous amount of work. I say it was bluntly, it was a lot more work than writing a PhD thesis. And it was a long slog from 2015, when I literally created the first page, started in earnest in 2017, seriously started writing in 2017, and then 2 years of working on it over weekends and on flights and trains and in spare moments on top of the day job. And some universities give you credit for this kind of work, popular science writing, but many don't. So you should think about that before you go into this. It was a hell of a lot of work. And if you go to a publisher like Penguin, you should be ready to do serious rewrites on their basis. The other thing I suffered from was mission creep. I think I wanted to do a kind of brain dump, everything I know about AI. And so, I mean, this is advice that any editor would give you. Think very clearly about what the message of your book is and keep your focus. Keep it focused around that message. You need to have a very, very clear focus. And the opening chapters, the preface, the introduction, have to set the scene for the rest of the book by telling the reader, what that message is right from the outset. It's phenomenally important. They need to, your opening chapters need to communicate that stuff, and you then need to stay focused on it throughout. I think my problem was in the second book, when I gave the first draft, the reason that I had to do so much work is that I'd done a kind of everything I want to know about AI. It was a kind of informal textbook on the entirety of AI. Another lesson, and this is, again, I think most editors would say this, but I didn't really realize the truth of it until I tried to write a book. You may not be writing fiction, but you are writing a story nonetheless. It has to have narrative drive. There has to be a story to take your book forward. And if you don't, it very quickly becomes listless. And one of the most difficult parts of the book, the long book, the Road to Conscious Machines that I had, was the bits of the AI story when there weren't kind of dramatic things happening, where things were just kind of tootling along, when we weren't in a period of revolution or, the established orthodoxy being overthrown by young usurpers. And it's very easy to write the story around the times when that happened. But much harder when things are just plodding along normally. So building that narrative, think about what that narrative is and wrap the story around that. And framing it around human journeys is a very natural way to go. So AlphaGo, the movie, in case you haven't seen it, I know lots in the audience will have done, which is the story of AlphaGo. They do this beautifully by building it around the story of Lee Sedol and his journey throughout that. And on the one hand, and the DeepMind team on the other hand. So you're not writing fiction, but you are writing a story. And you have to have that narrative drive to take it forward. Just communicating the science is just going to be boring as hell. Lesson number 10, get an agent. It's perfectly feasible to publish without an agent, but an agent is the person who knows how to get the best deal for you, and who can get you foreign language translation rights and so on. If you try and do that on your own, it's going to be much harder. And there are many agents out there who deal with nonfiction, and you've got an advantage if you're going in, for example, as a professor from an established university, to be able to talk to agents. You've immediately got some credibility with them. They will want to see typically 10 to 20,000 words to prove that you can write, to prove that you can actually do this. But if you sign up with an agent, you won't regret it. They will open doors for you in a way that you just won't have doors opened on your own. Maybe you can get a publishing deal without an agent. That's perfectly feasible. And I know many colleagues who've done popular science books without an agent, but it's much easier with an agent. Because, as we know in multi-agent systems, the point of an agent is they work on your behalf. Okay, this is just the truth. And I've learned this not just from these books, but the books that I've written recently, but from all the books that I've written. Once you've written a book, it goes off across the globe, and people will pick it up in bookshops in the Singapore airport or a university library in Spain or whatever. and people will feel motivated to write to you, to tell you about what your book meant to them, what they learned from it, and it will influence them. And this is a quote from a novel called English Passengers by Matthew Neal, and it's absolutely the literal truth. Publication is a powerful thing. It can bring a man or woman all manner of unlooked for events, making friends and enemies of perfect strangers, and much more besides. And that's just so true. You make friends and enemies of perfect strangers. Some people will read your book and love it. Some people will be outraged by it and think you're an immoral monster. One Amazon reviewer said, have AI researchers got a moral compass? Not if we must believe Wooldridge's book. There we go. Yeah, that's what happens when you write books. You make friends and enemies of perfect strangers, and much more besides. But once you've written this book, it will get out there to parts of the world that you just can't imagine, which is, on the whole, very, very rewarding. Okay, the other thing I've done is literary festivals. And these in the UK are a big part of the publishing scene now. And you do them for two reasons. You do them because there are typically book signing opportunities. You go there and there'll be a large pile of your books and you get the opportunity to sign them. And that's great fun. You typically get to give a presentation, which is some distilled part of your story. So I gave a presentation to around about 400 people at the first one that I went to. And the first one that I went to was the Hay Festival. Here's a picture of me before I went in. To the Hay Festival. In the UK, the Hay Festival is the largest of the literary festivals. This is their large tent. I wasn't in the large tent. The big speakers will have, thousands of people in the audience. And typically the way it works is you'll do an hour-long talk, a few hundred people in the audience. You'll get a token fee, $100 or a couple of bottles of wine or something like that, or cheese, I think was the other option that I had. You get free registration to the festival and green room access. So the green room is the refreshments room where you can go and hang out with the other speakers, which is fun in itself. And the audience are typically bookish non-specialists. So this, I have to say, is a very different kind of speaking. I'm used to giving conference talks, but not this kind of talk. I don't have any great insights into this. You have to keep it high level, focus on ideas, forget about doing anything technical, give some narrative, be enthusiastic, be sincere, talk about the directions of no maths whatsoever, try and avoid technical terms. And it's a real buzz. You're in front of an audience live, an audience who, again, just like in the House of Lords, you're the professor, you're the person, you're the expert on this. They're there to hear about what you have to say. And that in itself is really, really exciting. It's a real buzz. But what did I learn? So firstly, when you say something like the machine learns from experience, it conveys something very different to a non-technical audience. So when I was first gave this talk and we went to the questions, there was somebody who was obviously horrified that machines learn. So, the machine learns? That's terrifying. What happens then? Now, of course, we know, because we're in this field and we talk about machine learning, we know what that means. We know that, AlphaGo learns to play a pretty good game of Go, and that's as far as it goes. It learns to optimize some function from inputs to outputs. But what people hear is when you talk about machines learning, they hear about a machine which, you leave on overnight and the next morning it's conscious and sentient as about to take over the world. And that is what people hear when you use terms like learning and perception and reasoning and problem solving and adversarial planning, planning against adversaries. People find that stuff terrifying. Right? So you need to be very, very careful. Whereas, if you said over time, the program converges to an epsilon Nash equilibrium, that's not so terrifying, right? That's a very different thing. And I'm not suggesting that you use that kind of terminology when you go out to a public audience. But be aware, terms like learn from experience convey something completely different and very frightening to a non-specialist audience. Lesson number 13, expect the press to be in the audience. They go to these events. This is the press, as in the newspaper press and the media generally. And they will look for stories. They go to these talks, particularly for the big speakers, probably not for academic speakers, but on prominent topics. If you're giving a talk about, for example, lethal autonomous weapons, expect the press to be in the audience, and they will try to find a story in what you say. They want to sell newspapers or get clicks. So, for example, if you criticize Elon Musk for example, in your talk, and I didn't do this, I hasten to add, but if you did, they will pick up on it. MIT professor, Oxford professor, Stanford professor criticizes Elon Musk, right? And so on. I mean, and if you, God forbid, if you criticize Stephen Hawking, the world's most famous scientist, they will pick up on it. In my case, I made an offhand comment about smartphones being able to detect dementia, and my point was just that one of the unexpected applications of machine learning was just that machines might be able to learn just from changes in the way that we use them. For example, about the onset of dementia. And somebody had made a comment to me about this. A colleague in Oxford had made a comment to me about this a couple of weeks before, and I dropped it into my talk just as a completely offhand remark. And the next thing I knew, literally the next day, it was a news story. It was 2 columns in a newspaper. So the press will be in the audience. They will be looking for stories. And if you make offhand remarks, if you make things that you think are intended to be jokes and not taken seriously, be aware that they can be taken seriously and they can be put out there. Finally, that's number 14. When you get to the question session, you get lots of strange questions. Will AI be able to cure cancer? When will we have driverless cars? Another noted one, which I've had a number of times. Do you think AI will be able to stop climate change? And it's very natural. We're human beings, right? We want to keep people happy. You're in front of 300 people. You don't want to say, don't be silly. That's not going to go down well. And you don't want to disappoint the audience, and you want to try and keep them happy. But it's difficult. You need to be careful not to be drawn into answering that question, because again, you'll find yourself in the press and on social media. So it's a very delicate act to try to communicate the excitement about what we're doing with some reality about what the technology can and can't achieve. So since my journey began with the BBC and other press, the BBC were only one. I mean, it started in 2014. I and a number of my other colleagues, and I mentioned some of them, people like Toby Walsh and Rao Kampambati, Stuart Russell, Ernie Davis and Gary Marcus and so on, many others in our community have found themselves being put in the spot of trying to communicate what AI is, what it can do, what it can't do, and potentially also how should my nation respond to what AI can do, communicating to a non-specialist audience. And I have to say, on balance, despite some missteps and some embarrassments, I found it an incredibly rewarding experience. And I say the idea that kids are learning to read by reading my AI book is just the most wonderful feeling imaginable. But it's a completely different skill set, right? That's not what you get to be a professor for, by and large, and it exposes you in a completely different way. 15 years ago, we didn't have these opportunities. Nobody was interested. And right now, the opportunities are endless. By the way, it won't last, right? I mean, within a couple of years, this will have died down. There will be another nanotechnology or quantum computing. Perhaps it will be quantum computing. Who knows? There will be another big story that will be in the limelight. I suspect it won't be us. So what is the most important lesson of all the lessons that I've learned? I think it's this one, and I'm aware that some people disagree with this, but I think the most important lesson is this one. If you don't inform the public about AI, then someone who knows even less about it than you will do. If you're not the person that stands up and exposes themselves and tries to state the reality of AI is and communicate the excitement while keeping the conversation balanced, then somebody else will step in who knows much less about it than you do. And that's just true. Just go on Twitter, go on social media, go on endless blogs about AI, and you will find that to be the case. So I think all of us have a responsibility as scientists who often take public funding to stand up and to expose ourselves, to put our heads above the parapet and to communicate the reality of AI today and where we think AI is going to go. So that concludes my talk. I'm very grateful to have had this opportunity. I hope that you didn't find that too boring. I hope that you found that reasonably useful and interesting. That's my story. And once again, thank you to AAAI and to the Educational Advances in AI community for giving me this opportunity.